The sun was beginning to set over into the quiet countryside, casting a warm, golden glow across the landscape. The sky painted itself with hues of amber and violet, reflecting off the gently swaying fields that stretched toward the horizon. A soft breeze carried the scent of fresh earth and pine, rustling through the trees like a whisper of forgotten memories. Ethan Carter stood at the entrance of the Cedar Creek Animal Shelter, his fingers unconsciously tightening around the worn straps of his backpack. He took a slow, measured breath, feeling the familiar weight of exhaustion settle in his bones. It had been 2 years since he had left the battlefield, but some days it still felt like the desert sand clung to his skin, refusing to let him go. 2 years since the war. 2 years since he lost Shadow. His boots, still scuffed from years of service, scraped against the gravel as he walked toward the shelter's front door. His sister Maggie had insisted that this was a good idea. You need something to ground you, Ethan. Something to pull you out of your head. Get a doll. It worked for me. Ethan had resisted at first. The idea of replacing Shadow felt like a betrayal, like trying to fill a space that wasn't meant to be filled. But the nights had been growing longer, lonelier. The ghosts of his past whispered to him in the quiet, and no matter how much he tried to shut them out, they always found a way in. So here he was, the receptionist, a kind-looking woman in her early 40s, greeted him with a warm smile. "Welcome to Cedar Creek. Looking for a companion today?" Ethan hesitated before nodding. "Yeah, something like that." She led him through a set of double doors into a long hallway lined with kennels. The smell of disinfectant lingered in the air, mixed with the earthy scent of fur and hay. Dogs of all shapes and sizes barked, whined, or stared curiously as he passed. Some wagged their tails enthusiastically, others merely watched with quiet, wary eyes. Ethan scanned them all, but none of them had that look, the look of a soldier. Then, just as he was about to turn away, a young kennel worker approached him hesitantly. She adjusted her name tag, Sarah, and cleared her throat. Mr. Carter, we actually have a dog in the back that you might be interested in. He was brought in a few weeks ago, a German Shepherd." Ethan's chest tightened. "A shepherd?" Sarah nodded. "Yeah, he's different. He doesn't interact much, doesn't really trust anyone. He's got scars, looks like he's been through a lot. We were told he was a former military K-9, but there's no paperwork on him. Just a collar with the name Shadow on it." Ethan felt the air leave his lungs. Shadow. The name hit him like a bullet. "Can I see him?" His voice was barely above a whisper. Sarah nodded and led him toward a quieter section of the shelter where the kennels were more isolated. Ethan's heartbeat pounded in his ears as they approached the last cage at the end of the row. And then he saw him. A large German Shepherd lay curled up in the corner of the kennel, his fur a mix of black and tan, though dulled by time and neglect. His ears, once sharp and alert, drooped slightly. His body was tense, as if bracing for something unseen, but it was the eyes that shattered Ethan's heart. They were empty, hollow. Shadow had always been full of life, his gaze sharp and intelligent, filled with the fierce loyalty of a warrior. But now there was no recognition, no warmth, just a distant, weary stare. Ethan swallowed hard, forcing himself to take a step forward. "Shadow?" The dog lifted his head slightly, but did not react beyond that. No tail wag, no sign of familiarity. Just silence. Ethan clenched his fists. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. Shadow should have known him. He should have leapt up, tail wigging, eyes bright with reunion. But instead, nothing. "He doesn't recognize me," Ethan murmured, his voice thick with something he wasn't ready to name. Sarah shifted awkwardly beside him. "He's been through a lot. We don't know his full story, but he was found abandoned in another state. Looks like whoever had him after the military just gave up on him." She hesitated before asking, "Do you know him?" Ethan's throat tightened. "Yeah," he said hoarsely, "I do." For a moment, the memories flooded back. The dusty training grounds where they had learned to trust each other. The missions where Shadow had saved his life more times than he could count. The nights in the barracks, when the only thing keeping Ethan from falling apart was the rhythmic sound of Shadow's steady breathing beside him. And now, after everything, Shadow was here, alive, but broken, just like him. Sarah watched him carefully. "Would you like to spend some time with him? We can take him to the play yard." Ethan forced himself to nod. Yeah, I would." She unlocked the kennel door cautiously, giving Shadow space to step out. The shepherd moved slowly, deliberately, his muscles coiled tight like a spring. Ethan stayed perfectly still, watching as the dog sniffed the air, scanning his surroundings like he expected a threat at any moment. It hurt to see him like this. They led him to an enclosed yard behind the shelter. The moment they stepped outside, Shadow's nose twitched as he took in the open air. Ethan knelt down a few feet away and reached out his hand. "Hey, buddy," he murmured, keeping his voice soft. "It's me, it's Ethan." Shadow barely moved. His ears flicked at the sound of his voice, but his body remained tense, his gaze darting between Ethan and the open gate. Ethan swallowed hard. He had been prepared for joy, for a moment of reunion that would heal the ache inside him. But this was worse than losing him the first time. Shadow was afraid of him. Ethan exhaled slowly, then did the only thing he could. He sat down. He let the silence settle between them, let Shadow see that he wasn't going to force anything, that he wasn't a threat. Minutes passed. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the yard. And then, just barely, Shadow took a single step closer. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Ethan watched as the dog hesitated, sniffed the air, and then, just as suddenly as he had moved, retreated back to the other side of the yard. Ethan didn't move, didn't push, he just waited. Because if there was one thing he knew better than anyone, it was that some wounds took time to heal. And no matter how long it took, he wasn't going to give up on Shadow. Not again. The drive home was eerily silent. Ethan had laid a blanket in the back seat for Shadow, hoping it would provide some comfort. But the dog lay stiffly, his body tense as if preparing for an unseen threat. The occasional flicker of his ears and the nervous twitch of his nose were the only signs that he was aware of his surroundings. Ethan stole a glance in the rearview mirror. Shadow's gaze was fixed on the passing landscape, avoiding eye contact. It felt unnatural, wrong. Shadow had always been alert, always watching Ethan, ready to react at a moment's notice. Now he was closed off, detached, as if he were simply a bar rather than the partner Ethan had known. The thought sent a sharp pang through his chest. Pulling into the driveway of his modest home, Ethan turned off the engine and sighed, rubbing his temples. The house wasn't much, just a small cabin on the outskirts of town, surrounded by open land and a few trees swaying in the soft evening breeze. It was quiet, peaceful, a far cry from the chaos of war. Ethan opened the truck door and stepped out. "Come on, buddy," he said softly, patting his thigh the way he always had. Shadow hesitated. His ears twitched, but he didn't move. Ethan frowned. In the past, the sound of his voice would have been enough. Shadow would have leapt out, tail wagging, eager to follow his lead. But now there was no eagerness, no recognition. "Okay," Ethan muttered, adjusting his approach. He stepped back and gave Shadow space, watching as the dog finally moved, slowly, deliberately, as if each step was an act of cautious calculation. When Shadow reached the ground, he stood still, scanning the area, assessing every detail. He didn't move until Ethan did, and even then he kept a safe distance, his body low to the ground like a soldier wary of an ambush. It hurt. Inside the house, Ethan had already prepared a spot for Shadow, a cozy corner with a new dog bed, fresh water, food, and even a few chew toys he had picked up on the way home. He set the leash down and motioned toward the space. "This is yours, buddy." Shadow didn't move. He stood near the doorway, unmoving, as if uncertain whether he truly belonged there. His eyes flickered between Ethan and the open door, calculating the risk. Ethan's heart clenched. This wasn't just distance. This was fear. Shadow had never feared him before. Trying to suppress the sinking feeling in his gut, Ethan decided to give him space. "All right," he murmured, stepping back. "Take your time." The night passed in near silence. Ethan left his bedroom door open, hoping Shadow might wander in like he used to. But when he turned off the lights, he heard only the soft shifting of paws on the wooden floor. Shadow never entered the room. Instead, he settled in the hallway, close enough to watch, but far enough to escape if necessary. Ethan lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythmic rise and fall of Shadow's breathing. It was a small thing, but it was enough. for now. The next morning, Ethan woke to find Shadow sitting near the front window, staring outside with an almost haunted expression. The sun spilled golden light across his fur, highlighting the scars along his back leg and ear, wounds from a past neither of them could forget. Ethan sat up slowly, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "You remembering something, boy?" Shadow's ears twitched, but he didn't turn around. Ethan sighed and pulled on a shirt before heading to the kitchen to make coffee. As he moved, Shadow's eyes followed him, not with recognition, but with caution. The weight of that gaze sat heavy on Ethan's chest. He knew this was going to take time, but he hadn't expected the emptiness. He had prepared himself for hesitation, for wariness, but not for this complete absence of familiarity. It was as if the years they had spent together had been erased. Still, he wasn't going to give up. He spent the morning trying to engage Shadow, starting with something familiar. A tennis ball. Ethan knelt down, rolling it toward Shadow with a soft smile. "Come on, boy, you remember this, don't you?" Shadow's gaze followed the ball as it came to a stop in front of him. But he didn't move, didn't sniff it, didn't nudge it, didn't care. Ethan's throat tightened. He picked up the ball and tried again, rolling it slightly closer. "Go on, Shadow, just give it a try." Nothing. It was as if the ball were just another meaningless object in a world that no longer made sense to him. Ethan swallowed hard. It wasn't just hesitation, it was disconnection. He tried other things. Food, a leash, commands from their old training days. Shadow reacted to none of it. Each failure chipped away at Ethan's hope, leaving him wondering if he was making a mistake. Maybe Shadow wasn't lost. Maybe he was just gone. But then later that evening, something changed. As Ethan was organizing his belongings, he found his old military vest tucked away in a closet. It was the same one he had worn on missions with Shadow. The fabric was worn, stained with sweat and sand, carrying the scent of a past they had once shared. Ethan hesitated before taking it outside, where Shadow lay curled up near the porch steps. "Let's see if you remember this, boy." His voice was soft, almost pleading. Shadow's ears perked slightly as Ethan dropped the vest on the ground between them. For the first time, Shadow moved towards something on his own. He sniffed the vest, his nose twitching as he took in the scent. His body stiffened. His tail flicked once, hesitantly, and then, just as suddenly as he had approached, he pulled away. Ethan's heart sank, but in the fleeting moment before Shadow retreated, there had been something different in his eyes. Something flickering just beneath the surface. A whisper of a memory, a shadow of what once was. Ethan sat on the porch that night, watching the stars while Shadow lay a few feet away. "I'm not giving up on you," he murmured. He didn't know if Shadow understood, but the dog didn't move away this time, and that, however small, was a victory. Over the next few days, the distance between them remained. But there were moments, small, fleeting moments, where something inside Shadow stirred. A subtle tilt of the head, a slight shift in his stance when Ethan spoke. And then, one evening, just before the rain came, Shadow did something he hadn't done in weeks. As Ethan lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, he heard the familiar sound of paws against the wooden floor. He turned his head, just in time to see Shadow stepping into the room, moving with slow, deliberate steps. The dog didn't climb onto the bed, didn't nuzzle Ethan's hand. But he lay down at the foot of the bed, closer than he had ever been before. Ethan swallowed against the lump in his throat. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The days stretched on, each one feeling like a slow battle neither of them knew how to win. The distance between Ethan and Shadow was less visible now, but still present, lingering in the air like a silent ghost. Ethan could feel it in the way Shadow hesitated before stepping into a room, in the way his eyes flickered with something distant, like he was standing at the edge of a memory, but too afraid to fall into it. It was exhausting, but Ethan didn't give up. He couldn't. So day after day, he tried. Sometimes he spoke to Shadow in the dark, letting his voice fill the empty spaces that had grown between them. Sometimes he sat near him, never reaching out, just existing beside him, hoping the presence alone was enough to remind him of what they had once been. It was slow, agonizing work. But then one evening, something happened. It was late, just before sunset. The sky stretched wide with streaks of burnt orange and violet, painting the world in hues of fading light and quiet sorrow. Ethan was outside, chopping wood, a task he had done 100 times over, a routine that kept his hands busy when his mind refused to quiet. The axe sank into the wood with a solid, rhythmic thud, the sound ringing through the empty yard. It echoed against the stillness, carving through the quiet like a distant gunshot. And that was when Ethan felt it, a presence. He turned his head, his movements careful, measured, not wanting to break the moment. Shadow was watching him. Not just a glance, not just passing interest. He was watching. Ethan held his breath. It had been so long since Shadow had truly looked at him. Slowly, carefully, Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out something he hadn't used in years. A whistle. His fingers traced over the cool metal before he raised it to his lips. And then, he blew 2 short bursts, the exact same call he had used in the field. The reaction was immediate. Shadow's ears snapped upright. His entire body tensed, muscles coiling like a loaded spring. His head whipped toward Ethan, his eyes wide, startled, alive. Ethan's heart pounded. "You remember that, don't you?" he whispered. For a fleeting second, something flickered in Shadow's eyes. Recognition, a shadow of something long buried. But then, just as quickly, he flinched. A shudder rippled through his body, his tail tucked so tightly it nearly touched his belly, his ears flattening against his skull. He took a step back, then another. His chest rose and fell with quick, shallow breaths. It wasn't recognition, it was fear. Ethan's stomach dropped. He had pushed too fast. Shadow wasn't just forgetting him, he was afraid of remembering. That night, the storm came. The rain fell in sheets, heavy and relentless, pounding against the roof like a relentless march of ghostly footsteps. The house felt smaller, darker, as Ethan sat on the couch, his head in his hands. He had thought that Shadow would come back if he just waited long enough. If he was patient, if he gave him time. But what if time wasn't enough? What if the dog he had known, the one who had saved his life, who had once trusted him unconditionally, was truly gone? Ethan swallowed hard, his throat thick with something he didn't want to name. And then, a sound, soft, faint, almost imperceptible beneath the storm. Ethan looked up. Shadow was standing at the threshold of the room, his fur damp, his eyes locked onto Ethan's with something unreadable in them. Ethan didn't move, didn't speak. He just waited. And then, Shadow took a step forward, then another. And then, in a motion so hesitant, so painfully slow, Shadow lay down near Ethan's feet, not beside him, not touching, but closer than he had ever been before. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. It wasn't everything, but it was something. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, something else was beginning. The next morning, the world was quiet. The storm had passed, leaving behind the scent of wet earth and something that smelled like a fresh start. Ethan woke to find Shadow still there, curled up near the couch, sleeping lightly. For the first time since bringing him home, he hadn't left. And Ethan knew. It was time. The final test. The one thing that would tell him if Shadow was still in there somewhere. Ethan went to the closet and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside was a collection of pieces from his past. Photographs, a few medals, a set of dog tags, and a rubber ball. Not just any ball, Shadow's favorite. Ethan turned it over in his hands before stepping outside. The air was crisp, the sun warm against his skin. Shadow was standing at the edge of the yard, watching the tree line. Ethan knelt down, rolling the ball toward him. At first, Shadow didn't move, didn't even blink. But then his nose twitched, his ears perked, and then his eyes locked onto it. Ethan felt his heart pound in his chest. Shadow took a hesitant step forward, then another, and then, in a single fluid motion, Shadow picked up the ball. Ethan nearly collapsed with relief. Shadow stood there, the ball clutched gently in his mouth, his body frozen. Ethan swallowed hard, forced himself to stay calm. "Come here, boy," he said softly. Shadow hesitated. A flicker of uncertainty, a shadow of doubt. And then he moved. Slowly, then faster, he crossed the distance between them. He stopped right in front of Ethan, dropped the ball at his feet, and lifted his gaze. And there it was. Recognition, memory, trust. And then, in a single moment that shattered everything, Shadow pressed his head against Ethan's chest. Ethan's breath hitched. His fingers curled into the thick fur. He felt the warmth of him, felt his heartbeat, felt everything they had lost and everything they had just found again. "You remember," Ethan whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Shadow let out a soft whine, nuzzling into him. Not just a dog, not just a soldier, but a friend who had come home. That night, Ethan didn't sleep alone. Shadow curled up beside him, his breathing steady, his body finally relaxed. For the first time in 2 years, Ethan didn't feel like he was still at war, because Shadow had come back to him, and no matter what had happened before, they had found each other again. They were finally home.